The jungle air hung thick and still in the pre-dawn darkness of August 21st, 1942. Private First Class Robert Leckie pressed his cheek against the worn wooden stock of his Springfield 1903 rifle, the metal warm from the equatorial night. Around him, other Marines of the 1st Division lay in hastily dug foxholes along a sandbar near the mouth of the Tenaru River on Guadalcanal. They had been on the island for exactly 2 weeks. Leckie's rifle felt wrong in his hands. Not broken or damaged, just old, antiquated. The bolt-action Springfield had been designed nearly 40 years earlier, adopted when Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House, and the Wright brothers had yet to fly. It held only 5 rounds. Every shot required manual cycling of the bolt. While Leckie worked his bolt, he knew that somewhere back in the States, Army units were receiving the new M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. But here, at the edge of nowhere, facing an enemy that had conquered half the Pacific, the Marines made do with what the Corps had given them, a rifle from another war, another era. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Leckie and his fellow Marines could not yet understand was that their supposedly outdated rifle would prove ideally suited for the kind of war they were about to fight. Within hours, they would discover that the Springfield 1903's greatest asset was not its rate of fire, but something far more valuable: the ability to kill with precision at ranges the enemy believed impossible. The collision between Japanese tactical doctrine and Marine marksmanship culture was about to produce one of the most lopsided engagements in military history. 800 Japanese soldiers would charge across open ground toward entrenched Marines armed with rifles the Japanese had dismissed as relics. By dawn, the sandbar would be carpeted with bodies, and a lesson would be written in blood. Sometimes the oldest weapon is exactly the right one. To understand why the Springfield 1903 became such a devastating tool in Marine hands, we must first examine the culture that had been built around it. The United States Marine Corps, from its earliest days, had elevated marksmanship to the level of religious devotion. Every Marine a rifleman was not merely a slogan, but a fundamental principle that shaped training, tactics, and identity. While other services might emphasize various specialties, the Marines insisted that regardless of one's eventual role, whether cook, clerk, or infantry, every man would first and foremost be a trained rifleman. This obsession with marksmanship had been forged in the trenches of France during the First World War. At Belleau Wood in June of 1918, Marines armed with Springfield 1903 rifles had demonstrated a level of precision that shocked both allies and enemies. German forces, advancing across wheat fields toward Marine positions, discovered, to their horror, that they were already within range. Marines opened fire at distances, approaching 800 yards, far beyond what European armies considered practical combat ranges. The common wisdom of 1918 held that rifles were effective to perhaps 250 yards in actual combat conditions. The Marines, with their Springfields, were killing men at more than 3 times that distance. The German soldiers crumpled and fell before they even understood they were being engaged. Those who survived the initial volleys and managed to press the attack found themselves caught in a withering fire that seemed to anticipate their movements. The Marines did not spray bullets wildly. They aimed, fired, worked their bolts, and fired again with mechanical precision. Each round was placed with care. Each squeeze of the trigger represented hours of training on American rifle ranges. By the time German forces reached what they considered fighting distance 100 to 200 yards from the Marine lines, their attack had already been broken. American rifle fire had achieved what European armies typically required massed artillery and machine guns to accomplish. This performance earned the Marines a reputation that would follow them for decades. German intelligence reports began referring to the Marines as Teufelhunden devil dogs, a name that captured both respect and fear. The Marines, for their part, understood that their deadliness stemmed not from superior courage or ferocity, but from superior training with a superior rifle. The Springfield 1903, with its Mauser-derived action, excellent trigger, and inherent accuracy, had become an extension of the Marine rifleman himself. The rifle's design contributed significantly to its effectiveness. Based heavily on the German Mauser action, the Springfield incorporated two massive locking lugs at the front of the bolt that locked directly into the receiver. This design provided exceptional strength and rigidity when the rifle fired, which translated to consistent accuracy. The trigger broke cleanly at around 5 pounds of pressure, heavy by modern target rifle standards, but predictable and reliable. The 24-inch barrel provided excellent velocity to the .30-06 cartridge while remaining short enough for practical handling. The ladder-style rear sight could be adjusted for ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, though Marines typically zeroed their rifles for more practical distances. But hardware alone did not explain Marine accuracy. The real secret lay in how the Corps trained its men. Marine marksmanship instruction began the moment a recruit arrived at boot camp and continued throughout his career. During training, Marines fired from multiple positions: prone, sitting, kneeling, standing at targets placed at 200, 300, and 500 yards. They learned to read wind, compensate for elevation, control their breathing, and squeeze the trigger without disturbing their sight picture. They memorized the ballistic characteristics of their ammunition. They learned how a .30-06 bullet dropped over distance, how crosswinds pushed it left or right, how temperature and humidity affected its flight. The Marine Corps was the only American service that required recruits to shoot at ranges as distant as 500 yards. This was not arbitrary. The Corps understood that battlefield conditions, stress, fatigue, fear, degraded performance. A Marine trained to hit targets at 500 yards during peacetime qualification would retain the ability to make effective shots at 300 or 400 yards when bullets were flying and men were screaming. The training built both skill and confidence. A Marine, who had spent hours perfecting his hold, his breathing, his trigger control, developed an almost instinctive understanding of his rifle's capabilities. This training created a peculiar relationship between Marine and weapon. Unlike soldiers who viewed their rifle as simply another piece of equipment, Marines developed what could only be described as intimacy with the Springfield 1903. They knew the serial number of their assigned rifle. They could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded. They understood its quirks, how the bolt felt when properly lubricated, the precise amount of pressure needed to release the safety, the sound it made when a round properly seated in the chamber. Drill instructors enforced meticulous care of the rifle. A speck of dust in the barrel, a hint of rust on the receiver, would result in punishment so severe that Marines learned to treat their weapons with reverence. This culture meant that when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, they brought with them not just rifles, but decades of accumulated marksmanship expertise. Every private had qualified with his Springfield. Every corporal could shoot. Every sergeant was an expert marksman. The rifle might have been designed in 1903, but the men carrying it represented the most advanced rifleman training system in the world. Yet, despite this training, despite the proven performance at Belleau Wood, many Marines boarding ships for Guadalcanal felt under-equipped. Word had spread through the ranks that the Army was receiving the new M1 Garand. The Garand could fire 8 rounds without reloading. It required no manual bolt operation between shots. In a close-range firefight, the Garand provided overwhelming firepower advantages. A soldier with a Garand could keep a Japanese machine gun crew suppressed, while a Marine with a Springfield had to work his bolt between each shot, exposing himself to return fire. The Marines had actually tested the Garand before the war. Marine ordnance officers had fired it, evaluated it, and submitted reports. The conclusion had been mixed. Yes, the Garand fired faster. Yes, it held more ammunition, but the Marines expressed concerns about reliability. The Garand's semi-automatic action meant more moving parts, more opportunities for mechanical failure. In the mud, sand, and jungle conditions the Marines anticipated fighting in, the simpler Springfield seemed more trustworthy. The Garand also fired from an 8-round en-bloc clip that ejected with a distinctive ping when empty, a sound that could alert enemy forces that a Marine was reloading. The Springfield's 5-round internal magazine, loaded via stripper clips or individual cartridges, made no such telltale noise. But the truth was more complex than these official justifications. The Marine Corps was the smallest and poorest of the American military services. When the M1 Garand entered production in the late 1930s, manufacturing capacity was limited. The Army, being much larger, received priority for the new rifles. The Marines, as was their custom, made do with what they could get. By 1942, substantial numbers of M1 Garands were rolling off production lines, but the 1st Marine Division preparing for Guadalcanal received Springfields. Not by choice, necessarily, but by circumstance. The men grumbled about this. They had seen newsreels of Army units training with Garands. They had heard stories from stateside Marines who had handled the new rifles. The feeling of technological inferiority gnawed at them. Here they were, preparing for the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, armed with rifles their fathers might have carried in France. Some Marines joked darkly about fighting a modern war with museum pieces. Others simply accepted it with the fatalistic humor endemic to the Corps. The Army gets the weapons, the Marines get the glory. And all the glory in the world won't stop a bullet when you're working a bolt action. What none of them yet understood was that the Pacific War they were about to enter would not primarily be fought at the ranges where the Garand's rapid-fire advantage mattered most. The jungles of Guadalcanal would impose their own tactical reality, one where the Springfield's precision would prove more valuable than the Garand's volume of fire. The Japanese military, meanwhile, approached the question of rifles from an entirely different philosophical framework. While American military doctrine emphasized marksmanship and aimed fire, Japanese doctrine stressed the spiritual power of close combat and the supremacy of cold steel. This was not mere propaganda or cultural posturing. It represented a fundamental difference in how the Imperial Japanese Army understood warfare. Japanese infantry training devoted enormous time to bayonet drill. Recruits spent hours practicing thrusts, parries, and charges, with bayonets fixed to wooden rifles. The bayonet was not viewed as a weapon of last resort, but as the ultimate expression of the warrior spirit. Japanese tactical manuals explicitly stated that the decisive moment in any engagement would come when infantry closed with the enemy and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Firearms were important for suppressing enemy positions and inflicting casualties during the approach, but the final victory would be won with the bayonet. This emphasis stemmed partly from Japan's military history and partly from practical considerations. Japan's war with China, ongoing since 1937, had repeatedly demonstrated that Chinese forces often broke and fled when Japanese infantry charged with fixed bayonets screaming, "Banzai!" The psychological effect of hundreds of men rushing forward, bayonets gleaming, proved devastating to poorly trained or demoralized opponents. Japanese commanders drew the lesson that aggressive close-range assault tactics could overcome superior numbers or defensive positions. The Japanese rifles reflected this tactical philosophy. The Type 38, adopted in 1905 and still in widespread use in 1942, fired a relatively mild 6.5mm cartridge. This round produced minimal recoil, which Japanese military theorists argued allowed for better control during rapid aimed fire. The Type 38 was also extremely long, over 50 inches, with bayonet fixed, which made it effective as a pike in close combat. Accuracy at extended ranges was acceptable but not emphasized in training. Japanese soldiers qualified at ranges similar to other armies, but they were not drilled endlessly in long-range precision, shooting the way Marines were. By 1942, Japan had begun introducing the Type 99 rifle, chambered for a more powerful 7.7mm cartridge. This rifle addressed some of the stopping power concerns raised during fighting in China, where the 6.5mm round had sometimes failed to immediately incapacitate enemy soldiers. But like the Type 38, the Type 99 was designed primarily for combat at ranges under 300 yards. Japanese tactical doctrine simply did not anticipate extended-range rifle engagements. This created a fundamental mismatch between Japanese expectations and American capabilities. Japanese intelligence assessments of American fighting qualities, gleaned largely from Hollywood films and propaganda about American softness and materialism, suggested that American troops would not stand firm in close combat. The Japanese genuinely believed, that when faced with a determined bayonet charge, American forces would break and run. This assessment had been reinforced by easy Japanese victories throughout the Pacific in the war's first months. American and Allied forces in the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had been overwhelmed by aggressive Japanese tactics. Why should Guadalcanal be any different? The Japanese soldiers preparing to assault the marine positions at the Tenaru had been thoroughly indoctrinated in this worldview. They belonged to the Ichiki detachment, named for their commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. These were veteran troops, many with combat experience in China. They had trained extensively in amphibious operations and had been originally designated for the invasion of Midway Island, an operation cancelled after the devastating Japanese naval defeat in June. The cancellation had frustrated these men. They were eager to prove themselves, to demonstrate the superiority of Japanese arms and spirit. Colonel Ichiki himself exemplified the aggressive confidence pervading Japanese ranks. He had received intelligence estimates suggesting that no more than 2,000 Marines held Guadalcanal. His own force numbered approximately 900 men in the initial wave, with additional forces following. Ichiki believed he possessed sufficient strength to overwhelm the Marines through sheer audacity and fighting spirit. His plan was simple: approach the Marine positions under cover of darkness, fix bayonets, and charge. The Marines, soft Americans, unused to hardship and combat, would either flee or be swept away in the assault. What Ichiki failed to understand, what Japanese intelligence had completely missed, was the nature of the force he was about to engage. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not demoralized garrison troops or undertrained colonial militia. They were members of the 1st Marine Division, one of the most professional military formations in the world. And while they carried supposedly outdated rifles, those rifles were in the hands of men who knew precisely how to use them. The night of August 20th passed in tense anticipation. Marine listening posts reported movement in the jungle. Patrols encountered Japanese scouts. It became clear that a significant enemy force was approaching from the east. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the Marine forces on Guadalcanal, ordered units to strengthen defensive positions along the Tenaru. Machine gun crews dug deeper emplacements. Riflemen cleared fields of fire. Artillery plotted coordinates for likely assault routes. As darkness fell on August 21st, Marines along the Tenaru River settled into their foxholes and waited. They had been issued extra ammunition. Some men carried 100 rounds or more for their Springfields, far more than the standard combat load. They fixed their bayonets, not because they expected hand-to-hand combat, but because standing orders required it. They checked and rechecked their rifles, ensuring bolts operated smoothly, that magazines were properly loaded, that sights were adjusted correctly. And then, in the pre-dawn darkness, they heard it. A sound that would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of voices, screaming, "Banzai!" in unison, the rustling of hundreds of men moving through jungle vegetation, the metallic sound of bayonets fixed to rifles. The Japanese charge had begun. Private First Class Leckie had never heard anything quite like it. The screaming seemed to come from everywhere at once, hundreds of throats producing a sound somewhere between a war cry and a death wail. "Banzai! Banzai! Tenoheika Banzai!" The voices rose and fell in waves as the Japanese soldiers crashed through the jungle vegetation toward the sandbar. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Then they emerged from the tree line. In the faint pre-dawn light, Leckie could see them line after line of Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, charging at a dead run across the sandbar toward the Marine positions. They did not attempt to take cover. They did not fire and maneuver. They simply charged, screaming, certain that their superior spirit and the shock of cold steel would carry them through any resistance. It was exactly the wrong tactic against exactly the wrong enemy. The Marines had been waiting for hours, eyes adjusted to the darkness, fingers resting lightly on triggers. They had carefully cleared fields of fire during the previous day, removing vegetation that might obscure targets. They knew the exact distances to various landmarks. That fallen log was 200 yards out. That distinctive palm tree marked 300 yards. The far edge of the sandbar was roughly 400 yards. This was not accidental. This was the product of training that emphasized range estimation as a fundamental skill. When the Japanese emerged into the open, sprinting across the sandbar, Marine sergeants gave the order almost casually. Pick your targets. Aim low. Fire when ready. The first volley was ragged individual Marines firing as their sights settled on targets, but the effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers fell as if struck by an invisible scythe. Men running at full speed suddenly pitched forward, their momentum carrying them several more feet before they collapsed into the sand. Others spun sideways, hit in the shoulder or torso, their rifles flying from their hands. The crack of Springfield rifles firing echoed across the river, not the rapid staccato of automatic weapons, but a steady, deliberate rhythm. Crack, crack, crack. Each shot placed with care. The Japanese, committed to their charge, pressed forward. This was what their training had prepared them for, to endure casualties, to close the distance, to drive home the bayonet attack. They had been taught that casualties during the approach were inevitable, that American firepower might be heavy initially, but that American resolve would crack once Japanese infantry reached close quarters. Colonel Ichiki's battle plan depended on this. His men would absorb losses during the charge, but, once they reached the Marine positions and engaged with bayonets, American softness would be revealed. But the Marines were not missing. At ranges where most infantry firefights devolved into suppressive fire and wild shooting, the Marines were making aimed shots. A Japanese soldier running across open ground at 250 yards was not a particularly difficult target for a man who had spent months shooting at stationary targets at 300 and 500 yards. The Marines had trained for this exact scenario without even knowing it. All those hours on the rifle range, all that emphasis on breathing control and trigger squeeze, all that practice at extended ranges, it had prepared them perfectly for the reality of Guadalcanal. The Springfield 1903 rifles performed flawlessly. The bolt action, far from being a handicap, actually contributed to accuracy. Each time a Marine worked his bolt, he had a brief moment to reacquire his target, to adjust his aim, to account for movement. The manual cycling imposed a rhythm that prevented the kind of wild spraying that could occur with automatic weapons. Fire. Work the bolt. Fire again. The 5-round magazine was sufficient because the Marines were not wasting ammunition. Each round was fired with purpose. The Japanese tactics, designed for an enemy that would panic or break under the psychological pressure of a screaming bayonet charge, instead created a killing field. By massing their infantry and charging across open ground, the Japanese had transformed themselves into an ideal target array for trained marksmen. Every Japanese soldier visible on the sandbar was a potential target. The Marines, firing from prepared positions with clear fields of fire, could engage enemy soldiers from the moment they emerged from the jungle until they either fell or reached the Marine lines. And the Japanese were falling long before they reached those lines. Men hit at 300 yards crumpled immediately. Those hit at 200 yards often had time to take a few more steps before collapsing. The Marines aimed for center mass, the torso where a hit from the powerful .30-06 cartridge produced immediate incapacitation. The 150-grain Spitzer bullet, traveling at nearly 2,900 feet per second at the muzzle, retained lethal energy well past 500 yards. At the ranges, the Marines were engaging mostly 200 to 400 yards. The bullet struck with enough force to punch through bone and organs, creating devastating wound channels. Japanese officers, recognizing that the initial charge was faltering, rallied their men for successive waves. More soldiers emerged from the jungle, bayonets gleaming in the growing light. They charged over the bodies of their fallen comrades, still screaming, "Banzai!" Still certain that Japanese fighting spirit would prevail. This was the core of their military doctrine. that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantages, that the willingness to die would unnerve enemies who valued their own lives too highly. But courage, however extraordinary, could not deflect bullets. The Marines continued their methodical work. Sergeants called out targets. Second squad, concentrate on that group on the left. Machine guns, traverse right. The rifle fire never stopped. Individual Marines fell into an almost mechanical rhythm. Acquire target, aim, fire, work, bolt, eject, spent casing, chamber fresh round, acquire next target. The Springfield's action was smooth, the ejection positive. Spent brass accumulated around the foxholes as the sun began to rise. Marine machine gunners added their fire to the defensive effort, but it was the riflemen who did the bulk of the killing. The Browning 1917 water-cooled machine guns were devastating against massed targets, but they were relatively few in number and had to be carefully employed to avoid overheating. The rifles were everywhere. Every Marine in the defensive line was a rifleman, and every rifleman was scoring hits. The effectiveness of this defensive fire began to have a psychological effect on the attacking Japanese. Soldiers who had been taught that Americans were soft, that they would flee in the face of determined assault, were instead dying in windows before they could close to bayonet range. This was not how it was supposed to work. The confusion and shock began to undermine the attack's momentum. Some Japanese soldiers, having watched entire squads cut down, began to hesitate. The charge slowed. Men sought whatever minimal cover the sandbar offered, slight depressions, bodies of fallen comrades, driftwood. But the Marines had been trained to engage stationary targets as well. A Japanese soldier prone behind a log at 250 yards was actually an easier target than a running man stationary. Predictable. The Marines adjusted their sights, aimed carefully, and fired. 30-06 bullet, with its flat trajectory and substantial mass, would punch through light cover. Men who thought themselves protected behind inadequate concealment discovered, in their final moments, that the Springfield's penetration was formidable. As full daylight arrived, the carnage became fully visible. The sandbar was carpeted with Japanese dead and wounded. Blood darkened the sand. The screaming banzai cries had given way to the moans of the wounded. The initial assault wave had been shattered. Of the approximately 900 men Colonel Ichiki had committed to the attack, more than 700 were dead or dying. The Marines had suffered a handful of casualties, men hit by the scattered return fire the Japanese had managed during their charge, or wounded when Japanese soldiers actually reached the defensive line at isolated points. The disparity was staggering. This was not a fight, it was a slaughter. And the primary instrument of that slaughter was the supposedly outdated Springfield 1903 rifle in the hands of men who knew how to use it. Colonel Ichiki, observing the destruction of his command from the jungle, faced a reality that his training and indoctrination had not prepared him for. The Americans had not broken. They had not even wavered. His men, elite troops imbued with fighting spirit, had been mowed down like grain before a scythe. The tactical doctrine he had followed, aggressive assault, shock action, the supremacy of the bayonet, had failed catastrophically against an enemy that simply shot straighter than anticipated. The Japanese made one more attempt as the morning progressed. Reinforcements arrived, and Ichiki ordered them forward. Perhaps the Marines had expended their ammunition. Perhaps the defensive line could be flanked. The Japanese tried different approaches: infiltration by small groups, probing attacks seeking weak points. But everywhere they went, they encountered Marines with rifles, and those Marines hit what they aimed at. One particular engagement illustrated the Springfield's effectiveness with stark clarity. A group of approximately 50 Japanese soldiers managed to work their way around the Marine right flank, approaching through dense vegetation to within about 150 yards of the defensive positions. They fixed bayonets for a final rush, preparing to exploit what they believed was a gap in the Marine line. A Marine sergeant spotted them, calmly estimated the range, and passed word to his squad. 8 Marines, armed with Springfield 1903 rifles, engaged the Japanese infantry. What followed was a masterclass in aimed rifle fire. The Marines fired in a controlled manner, each man selecting individual targets. At 150 yards, the Springfield was supremely accurate. The Japanese, emerging from vegetation into the open for their charge, were engaged immediately. The Marines fired, worked their bolts, fired again. Within, perhaps, 2 minutes, 43 of the 50 Japanese soldiers lay dead or wounded. The remaining 7, shocked beyond the capacity for further offensive action, attempted to withdraw. Most did not make it. This engagement was not exceptional, it was typical. All along the Marine defensive line, similar scenes played out. Japanese infantry, trained for close combat and imbued with confidence in their superior spirit, encountered American riflemen trained to a standard they had never imagined possible. The collision between these two military cultures, one emphasizing spiritual determination and cold steel, the other emphasizing marksmanship and precision, produced entirely predictable results. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was effectively over. Colonel Ichiki's force had been annihilated. Estimates suggest that of the approximately 900 Japanese soldiers who had participated in the attack, fewer than 100 survived. Many of those survivors were wounded. The Marines had suffered 28 killed and 72 wounded, significant casualties, but a fraction of what they had inflicted. The disparity can be partially explained by Japanese tactical choices charging across open ground against prepared positions. But tactics alone do not account for the lopsided casualty ratio. The real explanation lies in the fundamental difference in how the two forces approached rifle fire. The Japanese expected to close to bayonet range and relied on shock action to carry their assault. The Marines expected to kill the enemy at range and had trained specifically to do so. The Springfield 1903 rifle, far from being a handicap, had proven ideally suited to this kind of defensive engagement. Its accuracy allowed Marines to engage individual targets at ranges where the Japanese did not expect effective fire. Its reliability meant that weapons continued functioning even after prolonged firing in humid, dirty conditions. Its robust construction meant that rifles could be dropped, knocked against foxhole edges, and dragged through sand without malfunction. The bolt action, which had seemed archaic compared to the Garand's semi-automatic system, imposed a fire discipline that actually improved accuracy under combat conditions. Marines who survived the battle spoke of it afterward with a kind of stunned disbelief. They had expected a hard fight. What they experienced was more like target practice against moving targets. One Marine corporal later recalled, "It was almost too easy. They just kept coming, and we just kept shooting. I don't think I missed more than a handful of shots. How could you miss? They were right there, running straight at you, no cover, no concealment. It was exactly like the range, except the targets were moving and shooting back, though not very accurately." This last observation about Japanese marksmanship highlighted another crucial factor. Japanese return fire during the Tenaru attack was largely ineffective. This was not because Japanese soldiers were cowards or incompetent, but because their training had not emphasized aimed fire while moving or under stress. The doctrine of closing to bayonet range meant that rifle marksmanship was somewhat secondary. Japanese soldiers were expected to fire during the approach to suppress enemy positions, but precision was not particularly stressed. The result was that Japanese return fire, while certainly dangerous, did not produce the kind of casualties that would normally be expected during such an extended engagement. The Marines, by contrast, had trained extensively in firing under stress. They understood that combat degraded performance, so they trained to standards that built in margins for degradation. A Marine who could consistently hit targets at 500 yards on the range retained the ability to hit man-sized targets at 300 yards when exhausted, frightened, and under fire. This training philosophy paid enormous dividends at the Tenaru. The aftermath of the battle presented its own horrors. The sandbar was littered with Japanese dead in grotesque positions, men frozen in mid-stride, others piled atop one another, where successive waves had charged over the same ground. The Marines, following standing orders, conducted sweeps to ensure no Japanese soldiers remained alive to threaten the defensive line. What they found shocked even hardened combat veterans. Japanese wounded, rather than surrendering, often attempted to kill Marines approaching to provide medical aid. Some wounded Japanese soldiers lay still until Marines came near, then detonated grenades, killing themselves and anyone within range. This behavior reinforced Marine distrust of Japanese forces and contributed to the brutal nature of Pacific combat. But it also revealed something about the psychological state of the Japanese soldiers. They had been so thoroughly indoctrinated in the idea of American weakness and Japanese superiority that their catastrophic defeat at the Tenaru could not be reconciled with their worldview. Rather than accept surrender or capture, many chose death. Colonel Ichiki himself committed suicide upon recognizing the complete destruction of his command. For the Marines, the Tenaru engagement validated their confidence in their training and their weapons. The Springfield M1903, which had seemed like an antiquated hand-me-down when compared to the Army's new Garands, had performed magnificently. Marines who had grumbled about being equipped with museum pieces now looked at their rifles with new appreciation. The weapon was not the problem it never had been. In the hands of properly trained riflemen, the Springfield was a precision instrument of death. This realization spread through the 1st Marine Division. Stories from the Tenaru circulated among units still holding other sectors of the defensive perimeter. Marines, who had not participated in the battle, heard detailed accounts from those who had. The message was clear: trust your rifle, trust your training, and the Japanese can be stopped. This boost in morale was incalculable. The 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal, knowing they faced a formidable enemy that had conquered vast territories. The Tenaru demonstrated that Japanese infantry, for all their vaunted fighting spirit, were vulnerable to American marksmanship. But the Tenaru was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the pattern would repeat itself across Guadalcanal. Japanese commanders, unwilling or unable to adjust their tactics, continued to order frontal assaults against prepared Marine positions. At Edson's Ridge in September 1942, Marine riflemen again demonstrated the killing power of aimed fire at range. At the Matanikau River in October, similar engagements produced similar results. Each battle reinforced the lesson. The Springfield M1903 rifle, in trained hands, was devastatingly effective against Japanese tactics. The Japanese emphasis on close combat and bayonet charges played directly into Marine strengths. If the Pacific War had been fought primarily in dense jungle where engagements occurred at 10 or 20 yards, the Garand's superior rate of fire might have provided decisive advantages. But time and again, Japanese commanders chose to attack across relatively open ground, creating engagement ranges where Marine marksmanship dominated. Interestingly, as Army units began arriving on Guadalcanal, equipped with M1 Garands, Marines who had the opportunity to compare the two rifles often developed nuanced opinions. The Garand was clearly superior for sustained firefights at close range. Its semi-automatic action and 8-round capacity meant that a soldier could deliver more firepower in a shorter time. But the Springfield retained advantages in accuracy, reliability in adverse conditions, and simplicity of maintenance. Many Marine snipers, when given the choice, continued using Springfield rifles fitted with telescopic sights throughout the war. The psychological impact of the Tenaru battle extended beyond the Marines. Japanese commanders analyzing the engagement struggled to understand what had gone wrong. Their intelligence had assured them that American forces were soft, that aggressive tactics would overwhelm them. The reality that American riflemen could inflict catastrophic casualties at ranges Japanese doctrine considered non-threatening did not fit their conceptual framework. Some Japanese after-action reports attributed the defeat to overwhelming American firepower, assuming that the Marines must have possessed automatic weapons or artillery in greater quantities than intelligence suggested. The simpler explanation that American riflemen were simply better shots was apparently too psychologically difficult to accept. This failure to accurately assess American marksmanship capabilities would haunt Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. At Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese defenders would experience the same deadly effectiveness of aimed American rifle fire. The pattern established at the Tenaru Japanese forces, suffering disproportionate casualties when exposed to American riflemen, would repeat itself across the Pacific theater. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the weeks following the Tenaru brought additional challenges. Disease, particularly malaria, began taking a heavy toll. Food supplies ran low. Naval battles offshore determined whether supplies could reach the island, but the Marines' confidence in their ability to defeat Japanese ground attacks remained unshaken. They had proven, definitively, that their rifles and training were superior. The Springfield 1903 would gradually be phased out of Marine service as M1 Garands became available in sufficient quantities. By 1943, most frontline Marine units carried Garands, but the rifle's legacy endured. It had carried the Marines through the first desperate months of the Pacific War, when the outcome hung in balance. It had proven that old designs, in the right hands, could still dominate battlefields. And it had demonstrated that sometimes the most important factor in combat effectiveness is not the weapon itself, but the training and skill of the man wielding it. The Japanese soldiers who died on the sandbar at the Tenaru had been brave, well trained in their own doctrine, and absolutely committed to victory. But they had charged into rifle fire delivered by men who represented the pinnacle of marksmanship training, armed with weapons designed for exactly this kind of precision engagement. The collision between these two approaches to infantry combat produced a massacre that shocked both sides and established patterns that would define Pacific ground combat for the remainder of the war. In the days following the Tenaru engagement, Marines walked among the dead counting bodies. The official tally varied slightly depending on the source, but the numbers told an unambiguous story. Japanese casualties exceeded 770 killed, American casualties 44 dead. The ratio was nearly 18-1. Even accounting for machine gun fire and the final artillery barrage that had sealed the Japanese defeat, the bulk of the killing had been done by Marines, with bolt-action rifles firing aimed shots at ranges the enemy had not anticipated. The psychological impact of this victory rippled outward in concentric circles. For the individual Marines who had fought at the Tenaru, the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of the war. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who had begun the battle feeling under-equipped with his old Springfield, now regarded the rifle with something approaching affection. It had not failed him. It had not jammed. It had sent bullets exactly where. He aimed them, again and again, until his target stopped moving. The weapon was not inadequate, it was precisely adequate, perfectly suited to the task. This sentiment spread through the 1st Marine Division. Conversations in foxholes and mess tents no longer featured complaints about lacking the Army's new Garands. Instead, Marines traded stories about shots made with their Springfields, distances estimated, targets engaged. The rifle became a source of pride rather than embarrassment. Yes, it was old. Yes, it held only 5 rounds. Yes, it required manual bolt operation. But none of that mattered when measured against results. The Springfield had enabled Marines to stop cold, an enemy assault that should have, by conventional military logic, reached their lines and created chaos. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the Marine forces on Guadalcanal, recognized the broader significance immediately. In his after-action reports, he noted that Japanese tactics appeared based on fundamental misconceptions about American fighting qualities. The enemy seemed to expect that aggressive shock action would overcome American defensive fire. This assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. Vandergrift stressed that Marine marksmanship training, which some peacetime observers had criticized as excessive or old-fashioned, had directly contributed to the lopsided victory. Every hour spent on rifle ranges stateside had translated into dead Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal's beaches. The battle's lessons traveled up the American command chain. At Pacific Fleet headquarters, at the War Department in Washington, at training bases across the United States, officers studied reports from the Tenaru. The accounts confirmed something that military theorists had suspected but not proven, that well-trained riflemen, even with bolt-action weapons, retained devastating effectiveness against infantry assault tactics. The machine gun had not rendered the rifle obsolete. Automatic weapons had not eliminated the value of aimed fire. Individual marksmanship still mattered, perhaps more than modern military theory had acknowledged. For the Japanese, the Tenaru defeat initiated a painful process of tactical re-evaluation that would, ultimately, prove incomplete. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal remained convinced that the battle had been an aberration, a product of poor intelligence or inadequate preparation rather than fundamental tactical flaws. They continued planning offensive operations based on the same premises that had failed at the Tenaru: that massed infantry assault would overwhelm American positions, that fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantages, that Americans would break under pressure. This obstinacy led to repeated catastrophes. In September 1942, Japanese forces attacked a ridge position held by Marine raiders under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. The engagement, remembered as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, followed the now familiar pattern. Japanese infantry attacked at night across relatively open ground. Marine riflemen, aided by flares that illuminated the battlefield, engaged targets at ranges between 100 and 400 yards. The Springfield rifles performed with the same deadly efficiency they had shown at the Tenaru. Japanese casualties again vastly exceeded American losses. After Edson's Ridge, Japanese intelligence officers began revising their assessments of American fighting qualities. Reports filed after the battle acknowledged that American troops demonstrated unexpected resilience and marksmanship. Some Japanese commanders started describing the Marines as elite troops, specially selected for their combat prowess. This was psychologically more acceptable than admitting that ordinary American training produced soldiers superior to their Japanese counterparts. The reports even spawned a remarkable piece of propaganda. Japanese officers told their men that the Marines on Guadalcanal were criminals, recruited from American prisons, hardened killers immune to normal human emotions. This myth allowed Japanese soldiers to maintain pride in their own courage while explaining repeated defeats. The reality was more prosaic and more damning. The Marines were not criminals or supermen. They were ordinary Americans who had received extraordinary training in a fundamental military skill: shooting straight. The Japanese military, for all its emphasis on fighting spirit and cultural uniqueness, had neglected this basic competency. Japanese soldiers learned to shoot adequately, but not exceptionally. They learned to charge with bayonets superbly, but charging with bayonets was increasingly irrelevant against enemies who killed them before they could close. As weeks turned to months on Guadalcanal, a peculiar situation developed. Army units began arriving with M1 Garand rifles to reinforce the Marines. For the first time, Marines could directly compare their Springfield rifles with the Garand under field conditions. The comparison produced nuanced conclusions. In close-range firefights, particularly in dense jungle where targets appeared suddenly at 10 or 20 yards, the Garand's rapid-fire capability proved valuable. A soldier could get more rounds downrange faster, which mattered when targets were fleeting and numerous. But for the defensive engagements that characterized much of the Guadalcanal fighting, the Springfield retained significant advantages. Its superior accuracy at extended ranges meant that Marines could engage Japanese forces earlier in their approach. The rifle's simplicity meant fewer maintenance issues in Guadalcanal's brutal climate. The island's humidity, rain, and coral dust infiltrated everything, and the Garand's more complex semi-automatic action occasionally required detailed cleaning that was difficult under field conditions. The Springfield, with its straightforward bolt-action mechanism, proved more forgiving of neglect. Marines observed that Army units with Garands sometimes expended ammunition at alarming rates. The semi-automatic action made trigger control more critical. A nervous soldier could empty an 8-round clip in seconds without hitting anything. The Springfield's manual bolt operation imposed a natural fire discipline. Each shot required a deliberate action: work the bolt, chamber a new round that provided a moment to reassess the target and aim properly. This enforced discipline actually increased hit probability under stress. Nevertheless, the Marine Corps made the decision to transition to the M1 Garand as supplies became available. The official rationale emphasized firepower and the ability to suppress enemy positions more effectively. Unofficially, Marine leadership recognized that maintaining two different rifle types across the service complicated logistics and training. As America's industrial capacity ramped up and Garand production increased, sufficient rifles became available to equip all services. By late 1943, most frontline Marine units carried M1 Garands rather than Springfields. But the Springfield 1903 did not disappear from Marine hands. It found a new role that would extend its service life for decades, as a sniper rifle. The same qualities that had made it effective in infantry, hands, accuracy, reliability, robust construction, made it ideal for precision shooting at extended ranges. Marine armourers selected the most accurate Springfield rifles from existing stocks and fitted them with telescopic sights. The most common configuration paired the Springfield with an 8-power unmatched scope, creating a sniper system capable of effective engagement past 1,000 yards. Marine snipers using these modified Springfield rifles became legendary in the Pacific War. At Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Marine snipers equipped with Springfield 1903s picked off Japanese officers, machine gunners, and other high-value targets at ranges that seemed impossible. The rifle's bolt-action design, initially viewed as obsolete for general infantry use, proved ideal for sniping. The manual bolt operation was quieter than a semi-automatic cycling action. The lack of a gas system meant that barrel harmonics were more consistent, contributing to accuracy. The strong action could handle heavy match-grade ammunition that provided superior long-range ballistics. One Marine sniper on Okinawa, firing a Springfield 1903 with an unmatched scope, recorded a verified kill at 975 yards, nearly 6/10 of a mile. The shot, taken in moderate wind against a Japanese officer observing American positions, demonstrated that the rifle retained lethality well beyond the ranges at which it had been employed at the Tenaru. In sniper variants, the Springfield continued serving through the Korean War and even into the early years of Vietnam, before finally being replaced by more modern platforms. The legacy of the Tenaru battle and the Springfield rifle extended beyond the specific weapon system. The engagement validated an approach to military training that emphasized individual skill development over technological solutions. In the decades following World War II, as military technology became increasingly sophisticated, there remained a temptation to assume that advanced weapons could compensate for reduced training. The Tenaru served as a reminder that technology without skill produced inferior results compared to skill with adequate technology. The Marine Corps internalized this lesson deeply. Throughout the Cold War and into the 21st century, the Marines maintained their emphasis on marksmanship training. Every Marine still qualifies with their service rifle. The standards are still demanding. The culture of every Marine a rifleman persists, a direct legacy of the Funter experiences on Guadalcanal, when riflemen with outdated weapons dominated a supposedly superior enemy through sheer shooting skill. For the Japanese military, the lessons of Guadalcanal came too late and were learned too incompletely. Japanese tactics evolved somewhat after the repeated disasters of frontal assault tactics. Later in the war, Japanese commanders increasingly adopted defensive strategies, using prepared positions, fortifications, and tunnel systems to maximize their advantages. This shift reduced the lopsided casualty ratios seen at places like the Tenaru, though American marksmanship still provided significant advantages in most engagements. But the fundamental problem remained unaddressed. The Japanese military never developed a training system that produced riflemen capable of matching American standards. This was partly cultural, the emphasis on spiritual qualities over technical skills, and partly practical. Japan lacked the resources for extensive live-fire training. Ammunition was precious, and Japanese training doctrine prioritized other uses for it. Japanese soldiers typically fired fewer rounds during training than their American counterparts, resulting in lower overall marksmanship proficiency. The human cost of this training disparity was staggering. Across the Pacific Theater, Japanese forces suffered casualties far exceeding their kill ratios. At Tarawa, roughly 4,800 Japanese defenders were killed while inflicting about 3,400 American casualties, a costly battle for American forces, but still a losing proposition for the Japanese. At Iwo Jima, over 21,000 Japanese defenders died, while killing nearly 7,000 Americans. At Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts died compared to about 12,000 American deaths. These aggregate numbers reflected countless individual firefights in which American marksmanship advantages accumulated into strategic superiority. The pattern established at the Tenaru, American riflemen inflicting disproportionate casualties through superior aimed fire, repeated itself across the Pacific War. The specific weapon mattered less than the skill behind it, but the Springfield 1903 had proven that even supposedly obsolete weapons could dominate when wielded by properly trained hands. Looking back across 8 decades, the story of the Springfield at Guadalcanal reveals a profound irony. The Marines went into battle feeling under-equipped, convinced that their old rifles placed them at a disadvantage against a modern enemy. They emerged from the Tenaru, recognizing that their supposed handicap was actually a precisely appropriate tool. The rifle's age meant nothing. Its 5-round capacity was sufficient. Its bolt action imposed discipline rather than limiting firepower. The Marines had not been under-equipped at all. They had possessed exactly what they needed, combined with the training to use it effectively. This realization transformed how Marines viewed their relationship with weapons. The rifle was not some magical talisman that guaranteed victory. It was a tool, nothing more, nothing less. Its effectiveness depended entirely on the skill of the man using it. A semi-automatic Garand in the hands of a poorly trained soldier was less effective than a bolt-action Springfield wielded by a Marine who understood range estimation, wind drift, bullet drop, and trigger control. Technology mattered, but training mattered more. The broader implications extended beyond military doctrine into questions about how societies prepare for conflict. The Japanese military had emphasized spiritual preparation, cultural uniqueness, and aggressive spirit. The American military, or at least the Marine Corps, had emphasized technical proficiency, systematic training, and measurable standards. When these approaches collided on Guadalcanal, the results demonstrated which philosophy produced more effective combat power. This is not to suggest that courage and determination are unimportant. The Japanese soldiers who charged across the sandbar at the Tenaru displayed extraordinary bravery. They knew they were running into gunfire. They watched their comrades fall, yet they pressed forward, driven by training, cultural expectations, and belief in their cause. That kind of courage deserves recognition, even when employed in service of a terrible regime pursuing an unjust war. But courage without effectiveness merely produces casualties. The Japanese soldiers at the Tenaru were brave, but their bravery was wasted. Their commanders had sent them into an attack that their training and tactics rendered suicidal. They charged across open ground into precision rifle fire delivered by an enemy whose capabilities they had fundamentally misunderstood. The result was foreordained. Hundreds of dead men scattered across a sandbar in the South Pacific, their sacrifice achieving nothing except to demonstrate the futility of their tactical doctrine. The Marines who shot them down felt little glory in the killing. After-action accounts describe the experience in terms ranging from mechanical, like shooting at a rifle range, to disturbing, I can still see them falling. The lopsided nature of the engagement produced guilt in some Marines, though this guilt was mixed with relief at having survived and satisfaction at having defeated the enemy. War contains these contradictions. Killing can be simultaneously necessary and disturbing, professionally executed and personally traumatic. Private First Class Leckie, whose experience opened this story, survived Guadalcanal and later wrote movingly about his time on the island. His description of the Tenaru emphasized the surreal quality of the engagement, the screaming charges, the methodical shooting, the piles of enemy dead. He noted that after the battle, Marines who had never before fired at human beings now had extensive experience killing. This changed them in ways both obvious and subtle. They had learned that they could function under extreme stress, that their training held up when tested, that their rifles worked as designed. They had also learned that killing, however necessary, extracted a psychological toll. The Springfield rifle itself became a symbol of that complex experience. It represented the Marine Corps' identity, the value of preparation, the persistence of old technologies in modern war. When Marines finally transitioned to the Garand, many felt a twinge of regret. The Springfield had seen them through the worst moments. It had never failed them. Giving it up felt like abandoning a trusted friend, even though the Garand was objectively a more modern and capable weapon for most purposes. Some Marines kept their Springfield rifles as souvenirs. Others saw them turned into depots, destined for conversion to sniper rifles or storage. The rifles themselves, manufactured between 1903 and the early 1940s, had witnessed extraordinary history. They had been carried at Belleau Wood, in Nicaragua, at Wake Island, at Guadalcanal. They had killed German soldiers, Nicaraguan guerrillas, Japanese infantry. They had served with distinction across 4 decades and would continue serving in specialized roles for several more. In the final accounting, the Springfield 1903 stands as one of the most successful American military rifles ever produced. It was not the most advanced, it was not the most modern, but it was superbly designed, robustly constructed, and capable of extraordinary accuracy. In the hands of trained Marines on Guadalcanal, it demonstrated that old designs could still dominate battlefields when fundamental principles, accuracy, reliability, ease of use were prioritized over novelty. The 800 Japanese casualties at the Tenaru testify to this truth. So do the thousands more Japanese soldiers killed by Marine rifle fire across the Pacific Islands. The Springfield 1903 proved adequate to every task demanded of it, not through technological sophistication but through elegant simplicity married to rigorous training. Sometimes the old ways work because they work, because the fundamentals aim carefully, squeeze the trigger, hit what you shoot at, never become obsolete. As the sun set on August 21st, 1942, Private First Class Leckie cleaned his Springfield rifle with methodical care. He removed the bolt, swabbed the barrel, wiped away the carbon fouling from a day's firing. The weapon had functioned flawlessly. In return, he would maintain it properly. This relationship, Marine and rifle, each reliable, each dependent on the other, had won the battle. No amount of enemy courage could overcome it. No alternative tactics could negate it. The Marines had trained, they had shot straight, they had won. The supposedly outdated rifle had proven more than adequate. It had proven perfect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.